Hello, my name is Andrew Whittemore at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and today I'm going to be talking to you about single family detached housing. Today I'll be lecturing on the central place of the single family detached home in US urban history. It's the most common type of home in the US, composing nearly two-thirds of dwellings. It has historically been seen as a very sensitive land use. Its value is dependent upon its situation in a very restricted area of few activities aside from residential and really no other type of housing. It is not the single family house itself per se, but it's the very sensitive nature of its value in traditional American culture that has been the principal driver of exclusionary zoning. So, as Sonia Hurt has written in her book Zoned in the USA, understanding American zoning perhaps foremost involves understanding the prevalence of exclusive zoning for single family detached housing. It is what the great majority of residentially zoned land in the US has been restricted to. Single family zoning and frequently associated devices, like definitions of what constitutes a family, large minimum lot sizes, minimum floor area requirements, minimum lot frontages, prohibitions of manufactured housing or mobile homes. These are primary ingredients of exclusionary zoning, and the extent of their use sets the US apart from everywhere else, as far as I know. The most obvious reason for so much single family zoning and these other often associated devices is that so many Americans have historically owned and occupied this type of housing. How did this come to be? The US, along with a few other Anglo dominated settler societies like Australia and Canada, are exceptional in this regard among high wealth countries, if not among in the entire world. Although I should add that Canada and Australia have greatly decreased their use of single family zoning in the last 50 years, despite historically having very similar housing stocks. So today I'll be talking about four factors explaining why the single family detached home became so widespread in the US. These are a relatively unconstrained supply of land, access to that land, especially on the urban periphery by ever faster modes of transportation, Anglo-American cultural values in regards to home life, and when we get to the 20th century, the subsidy of single family home construction and ownership by the federal government. This lecture will also get at some of the reasons why single family houses, particularly in commuter suburbs, became associated with such restrictive practices, land use practices. But that will primarily be saved for the next lecture with Professor Reese and subsequent lectures after that. So first I want to briefly review what exclusive zoning for single family detached housing looks like. Zoning regulates use, it regulates density when we're talking about residential uses, and it regulates bulk. In a single family zone, this means no uses but a residential use, perhaps some very limited commercial use like a home occupation. Churches, schools, and parks, all seen as essential ingredients of American family life, are also allowed here. Density, and here we're talking about a maximum number of dwelling units per acre, and then a restriction of one dwelling per lot and one family per lot. And a family is then further defined as 4 to 5 unrelated individuals or a larger number of related individuals. These are all the regulations in relation to density. Finally, we have bulk. We have setbacks from each property line, and especially the large front setback. This sets these areas apart from traditional ways of building cities. This relatively small building coverage, a setback of a street, would have been highly impractical in traditional cities, really throughout the world before the modern era and modern means of transportation. We have setbacks from each property line. We have a maximum height. These are the bulk regulations. These together create an envelope. And as you can see here in Culver City, California, we have newer housing built out more or less to the boundaries of this envelope. You can see this here on the left. So why did single family home ownership become so common in the United States? Well, in the first place, we have this supply, this plentiful supply of appropriated and commodified land. The indigenous populations of the American continents and Australia as well were decimated by disease. They had no or minimal previous exposure to various old world diseases, and land was simply appropriated from reduced populations. Even where settlers held some notion of indigenous title, it was on limited, tilled land, and these rights didn't often outlast conflict. The English in the 17th century, when they came here, they regarded indigenous hunting and gathering areas as waste because they were not being improved in their eyes, and in other words, put to the most economically productive use with the means Europeans possessed. As John Winthrop, the founder of Boston, wrote, quote, "For the natives in New England, they enclose no land, neither have they settled habitation, nor any tamed cattle to improve the land by." This isn't necessarily entirely accurate, but this perception is what underlay the justification in European eyes for their treatment of the indigenous people. Nor did large landholding aristocracies or states develop here. Especially after independence, we see how land acquired through purchase or war is being readily commodified, acquired by homesteaders and investors. They own the land fee simple, with no or few constraints on selling, renting, subdividing, developing, farming, mining, and so on, thus creating very dynamic land markets. Construction for defense was also not really necessary. The kind of tightly packed residences along winding lanes you see in older European or Middle Eastern cities, the walling of cities, these things were generally unnecessary. So you don't have these constraints. You don't have the large landholding aristocracy. You don't have the need for defense, and there's not really any recognition of indigenous claims to the land. This leads to greatly increased land consumption and lower density patterns of residential development. One interesting aside here is the early land use practices of Puritan communities in New England. These practices didn't really outlast the 17th century, but there's an interesting precursor to zoning here. Puritans valued living in small communities for social, political, and spiritual reasons, and they limited subdivision in their communities beyond the original allocation of property. So, like modern zoning, this created a maximum build out of these communities with population growth not leading to more intensive development, but to hiving off new communities. This practice, however noble in its intentions, led to increased land consumption and conflict with the indigenous people. American land use practices today are also associated with increased land consumption for urban purposes. But today, this leads to a different set of problems: auto dependency and higher greenhouse gas emissions per capita, destruction of valuable agricultural land or other types of open spaces, and so on. So you have this relatively unconstrained supply of land. In the second place, you have an ongoing transportation revolution beginning in the first half of the 19th century. Right? Land is not going to be developed for urban purposes unless it has a pretty high degree of access. And the American urbanite of the early republic, whose life was probably revolved around a port in some way, they couldn't get too far away from that port with the options available in 1800. In the American city of the early 19th century, work, even for elites, was tied to the home, and it was usually unthinkable that an urban merchant, attorney, or doctor would live far from their place of business and their customers. Blocks were solidly built up with the best places of residence on the periphery, next to the ventilation that streets brought into the city. And then lower income people lived in housing built in interior lanes in the blocks. This was class integration by modern standards, but it was no egalitarian paradise. Leveling forces like public schools did not exist. Cities established curfews and other restrictions on the movement of enslaved and free Africans, and so on. Some of the wealthy possessed peripheral villas, but only for weekending. Daily or frequent commuting was impossible. Only the wealthy owned a private chaise. You can see that illustrated up here in the left-hand corner. Only the wealthy owned a private chaise, and the condition of roads made daily travel over a couple miles unreasonable. Henry Binford, in A History of Early Suburbanization in Boston, details how Josiah Quincy, an early 19th century mayor of Boston, who became the president of Harvard College, was a famous exception, and his extreme commuting behavior created problems for Cambridge residents when he would fall asleep in his chaise on the way back from Boston. He'd wake up in Cambridge at 4 in the morning. He would work at the college in the morning, be in the city in the afternoon, and then fall asleep on the way home and depend on his horse to remember the way. This leading to near accidents with omnibuses and with teamsters bringing goods in and out of the city. Before the 1830s, the urban periphery was truly suburban in the traditional sense of the word. It was outside of, below, and serving the dominant city. The urban periphery was built up with private turnpikes, quarries, clay pits, small farms, and small industries that processed goods for the city market, and small villages of workers associated with some of these activities. From the 1820s, you have access enabled by omnibus, horse car, and finally the streetcar, enabling mass commuting, not by all, but by a growing number of middle-class people. Mass commuting becomes possible. There was the pull of a country home, but there were also a so-called country home. Of course, a suburban home was not the homestead of an agrarian household. It was the home of an urban commuter. So there was the pull of a so-called country home, but there were also urban push factors with the coming of new non-Anglo, non-Protestant immigrant groups. William Howells, in Sketches of Boston in 1871, wrote, quote, "Where the Celt sets his foot, there the Yankee rarely, if ever, returns," speaking to how the increasing presence of the Irish in Boston was driving Yankees, native-born Anglos, away from the neighborhoods the Irish settled in due to Yankee prejudice. The omnibus, which was described as a room on wheels, it was basically a small room with benches down either side, and you access it from the back, and it was pulled along the road by a team of horses. The omnibus and the steam railroad in particular were associated with elite commuting because they were rather expensive. Later modes were lower cost. The horse car was basically an omnibus, but on rails, which made things easier for the horse. The electrified streetcar, of course, was the same thing without the horse. These later modes were lower cost and especially enabled broader middle class commuting. These transit modes were all privately provided there was legislation allowing private companies to use and improve the rights of way. Streetcar companies especially made their profits through real estate development, buying up land at the end of their lines and then selling it when their lines granted access to that land for commuter development. So here we have this relatively unconstrained land supply and this continuing transportation revolution. Second, in this view from 1850 of Boston, from the top of the Bunker Hill Monument, you can see these turnpikes, which I think none of them were free at this point, and these steam railroads leading out of the city into this periphery, which had been this kind of mixed zone of small industries and farms, but at this time is coming to host a larger and larger number of commuters. So we need to talk about Anglo-American culture. Jackson, who you read for today, wrote about how in England, beginning in as early as the 18th century, the single-family detached home is becoming a, quote, personal bastion against society, with society specifically meaning the growing heterogeneous city of early industrialization. The detached home on its own lot offered a domestic realm for family-centered consumption, and for raising the next generation according to traditional Christian ideals of manhood and womanhood, away from the morally corrupting, or what we might see today as liberating, setting of the heterogeneous city created in the conditions of industrial capitalism, with its industries, its shops, its drunks, its foreigners. As transportation is allowing work to separate from the home of the middle-class urbanite, he becomes a commuter who sees the city as the place of manufacturing, the exchange of goods and services that is separate from the suburb. This was a socially conservative reaction to fast-changing urban conditions. Historian Bob Fishman wrote about how in London, suburban commuting was pioneered by evangelical Protestants. There, around the Clapham Common, a few miles southwest of the city, were 72 10-acre so-called gentlemanly seats in which elite families of the so-called Clapham sect settled for the entire week. This was unprecedented and exceptionally rare, given that means of travel at this time were generally by chaise and provided by the families themselves. But these families were wealthy and they were quite zealous. Residents regarded family life in these naturalistic surroundings to be godly, seeing London swell as ever growing evidence that the city was the creation of fallen man. Cain, the first city builder in Genesis, was also the first murderer. And industrialization and urbanization is spurring so-called millennialist fervor in Britain, the belief that Christ is about to return and usher in 1,000 years of peace. Manchester in England was the first city in which class segregation took on the very familiar core periphery city suburb class split that recognized by the Chicago School in the US in the early 20th century. An interesting contrast to what's going on in many UK and virtually all American cities at this point is what you see on the European continent, which is also industrializing and urbanizing at this time. Well, middle-class commuting has developed in these countries on the continent. State-directed renewal, as in Paris and Vienna, re-legitimizes the center as the preferred place of elite middle-class residences. The boulevards of Haussmann, the Ringstrasse in Vienna, these are lined with fashionable apartment buildings built according to very specific design standards. It's an anti-suburban means of guiding urbanization, re-establishing the urban bourgeoisie where they had traditionally been. In the US, Jackson talks about Catherine Beecher, an advocate for women's stewardship of the domestic sphere, their responsibility for child rearing. Through volunteer activities at school and at church, the middle-class homemaker could extend her home into a wider domesticated neighborhood environment. Jackson talks about Andrew Jackson Downing, the aesthete and snob, one of many important advocates for the single-family detached house in America in the 19th century. He saw the single-family detached house as the only appropriate setting for the maintenance of American Republican values, following from Jefferson's way of thinking about cities. The separation of the city as a place of economic production from the suburb as the place of social production for the privileged emerges very early on in planning conversations. British planner Thomas Adams spoke at North America's Conference on City Planning in 1911, opining that the most significant strand of the global Anglo planning movement were efforts to, quote, maintain and extend the healthy detached home life of our people, unquote. So what is it that makes the single-family detached home of the commuter valuable? Land ownership always had clear economic benefits, and at this time, clear political benefits, as it brought the right to vote in early 19th century Britain, the US, Canada, and Australia. Then, of course, you have the economic benefits in gaining this resource to farm, mine, rent, and so on. Land's value was always based on the degree to which it could yield resources. So how much corn it could produce, or how many tenements might be packed onto it in the city. But the value of land, when it was specifically used as a home by the person commuting out of the industrial city, this was more complex, and it was based upon the home's social value, not its economic potential. Its value was furthermore dependent on how its consumers, predominantly these middle-class Anglo-American commuters, saw not just the home itself, its number of rooms, its privacy, its gardens, but also the area around it, how the whole neighborhood was supportive of family life. From the mid-19th century, commuting homeowners sought to separate residential enclaves from the threats of the city through the moralizing influence of the neighborhood-situated church and the neighborhood-situated schools. You have schools moving away in these commuter suburbs. You have schools moving away from the main streets and the centers. Gone is the highway side one-room schoolhouse. You have them being pulled into the neighborhoods. You have petitions and injunctions against nuisances from commuter households. You have temperance campaigns against liquor sellers and drinkers. You have commuters persuading local legislators to refuse public services like water or street maintenance to industry. All of this is a precedent for private covenants and zoning, which you'll hear about in coming lectures. So, in summary, here, the value of the detached commuter home depended not just on the property itself, but the quality of a whole bundle of services and amenities that may or may not be present in the vicinity. This is why legal scholar Leanne Fennell says the value of the home is unbounded. Its value goes beyond its own boundaries and takes all these other things into consideration. There was a particular community aesthetic associated with the social and therein the market value of the single family detached home. This aesthetic is derived from 17th and 18th century picturesque landscape design. There's a long history here, and if you're interested in it, I recommend Raymond Williams' classic City in the Country. When English elites traveled to the continent for their grand tour, they encountered, among other things, the 17th century landscape paintings of the Dutch masters, such as the one you see here on the left by Jacob van Ruysdael. This presented to them a new way of looking at the natural landscape as something to be consumed for pleasure and for spiritual and moral uplift, rather than just exploited for resources. The maintenance of a naturalistic landscape as something to be consumed rather than just extracted from, as a yard with ornamental trees and shrubs offering views and recreation. This also became a statement of wealth, what sociologist Thorstein Veblen called conspicuous waste, and also a statement of character, of the gentleman's consideration for his family and his health, that he was godly and not of the city. And in a world in which circulating air and trees were believed to rid the environment of disease, such settings were understood to be physically nurturing too. Here you see Chiswick House outside of London. When this model is adapted for the commuter, as you see in Olmsted's plan for Riverside in 1869, we get curving small streets, such as cannot easily accommodate commercial traffic or loading, wide frontages, as opposed to the typical narrow urban lot to be built up from lot line to lot line, and huge setbacks of 30 feet. This is not the city, which is aimed at economic production and growth. It is separate from the city. The setbacks, the minimum frontage mandates, and other restrictions of covenants and then of modern residential zoning are an outgrowth of all this. The front lawn is the homeowner's contribution to the park-like aesthetic of the residential community. The yard is a sort of, the front yard especially, is a sort of collectively held amenity. When we get to the 20th century, we have to talk about the role of the federal government in subsidizing single-family development and home ownership. Before World War II, many middle-class and most working-class households could not afford a detached single-family home in suburbia. Mortgage lending was not well developed until after World War I, and without federal support of private lenders, buyers could only borrow about half of the value of a home, with typical mortgage lengths being 5 to 10 years in the US. The pace of urbanization, the constraints on mortgage lending, and a lack of alternatives to fee simple land ownership, for example, condominiums, which had long existed in the European continent. All of these things kept the American homeownership rate between 43 and 48% from 1890 into the 1940s. It's stagnant. And the homeownership rate among urban Americans would have been even lower. In the 1930s, the US federal government brought into existence the long-term, low-interest amortized mortgage, enabling more widespread ownership of suburban detached single-family homes. The Australian and Canadian federal governments followed suit after World War II. US regulators preferred to insure loans for homes in areas exclusively zoned for single-family housing, and thus incentivize more widespread adoption of single-family zoning. The Canadian government, too, favored purchases of single-family detached housing, and in Australia, it was also rare for banks to lend on anything but detached housing in the post-war years. So this federal support interacts with rising household wealth after World War II, and increasingly large and sophisticated builders. All these things interact to boost home ownership rates, with the rate exceeding 60% by 1960. Meanwhile, rising car ownership and consistent federal support for road building in the US from 1916 makes low density residential development ever more accessible. Roadway improvements included the construction of limited access freeway systems after World War II, the interstate system. This especially expanding access to new territories for low density suburban development. So there you have these four factors: this relatively unconstrained supply of land, access to that land, especially on the urban periphery, Anglo-American cultural values, and when you get to the 20th century, the role of the federal government in subsidizing single-family home construction and home ownership. Here we have the evolution from an Andrew Jackson Downing illustration of the single-family detached home in its country-like setting, to the mass-produced version we get in Southern California. This is the city of Lakewood near Long Beach in the 1940s. So Professor Reese is going to get into some of the early means of protecting the home. As discussed here, the value of the single-family detached home in an urban area in these commuter suburbs, which remember are urban, they're just a different form. The value of the single-family detached home in these places is based upon the evaluation of the entire residential environment by middle-class consumers, beginning with petitions against nuisances, petitions for neighborhood schools and for public maintenance of residential streets, then private covenants, then finally through zoning. Homeowners are developing all these means of excluding a range of perceived disamenities: lodgers, boarders, ethnic and racial minorities, home or lot subdivision, industries, commercial activities, agricultural activities, and even just a shabby appearance. All of these things were to be excluded. I am happy to take questions. You can email me at awhittem@email.unc.edu. Thank you.